Dead cats were rotting on the approach road to Versailles in the summer of 1764, and a government official was writing them down. His name was Tourmeau de la Morandière. His report survives, and gold appears nowhere in it. He walked the courtyards and corridors of the most famous building in Europe and found them fouled with urine and fecal matter. At the foot of the minister's wing, directly beneath the windows where the government of France did its business, a pork butcher had set up shop and was bleeding and roasting his pigs every single morning. And along the Avenue de Saint-Cloud, one of the three great avenues that converge on the palace like rays of a rising sun on every map you've ever seen, stretched the stagnant water where the cats had died. A pig butcher, under the minister's windows, at Versailles, and nobody at the time treated any of it as a scandal. La Morandière was filing a complaint, sure, but the things he listed were ordinary. The courtiers stepping around the butcher's blood on their way to petition the king had stepped around it yesterday, and they would step around it tomorrow. The palace with the Hall of Mirrors in it, the palace where diplomats from Siam and Persia were brought specifically to be overwhelmed, ran on a level of filth that would close a modern building within the hour. People were born in it, gave birth in it, rotted alive in it, and died in it, and through all of that, the fountains kept playing whenever the king walked past, and only when the king walked past, since the water could not manage anything more. So that's where we're going today. Down the gilded corridors and then down a bit further into the cesspits underneath them. Before we get into it properly, a quick hello. Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome in, get comfortable. This is a long one, so grab a drink and settle wherever you like to settle. Do me a small favor and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. I genuinely enjoy going through those. The spread of countries never stops surprising me. A big thank you, as always, to the supporters over on Patreon and to the YouTube members. If you'd like to join them and support the channel, all the links are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to the dead cats, or rather, back a full century before the dead cats, to the reason any of this existed at all, and to a piece of ground that nobody in their right mind would have chosen to build on. Versailles started as a swamp. Genuinely, a swamp. When Louis XIII put a small hunting lodge there in the 1620s, it was a damp, unremarkable patch of ground, surrounded by marshland and stagnant ponds, useful only for the game that lived in the woods nearby. The Duc de Saint-Simon, who lived at the finished palace for decades and wrote the most famous memoirs of the age, called it the saddest and most thankless of places, with no view, no wood, no water, and no soil worth the name, since everything there was either quicksand or bog. He meant it as an insult to the king's judgment. He was also, on the plain facts of the ground, correct. The Sun King took the most powerful monarchy in Europe and planted its heart on land that could not naturally support a village, let alone a city of courtiers, and then spent the rest of his life and a horrifying number of other people's lives trying to force the ground to cooperate. Remember that swamp as we go. Almost everything in this story flows out of it, sometimes literally. The bad water, the fevers, the stink, the dead workmen by the thousand. Versailles was a monument built against nature, and nature collected the bill in installments for over 100 years. By the time the court moved in permanently in 1682, the building had grown into something with no real precedent. More than 700 rooms, over 1,000 fireplaces, 67 staircases, and into that shell poured a population that historians have spent careers trying to count. The permanent residents alone ran to several thousand. On a great ceremonial day, with the full court in attendance, plus servants, plus the servants of servants, plus soldiers, clergy, cooks, grooms, petitioners, merchants, and the simply curious, the estimates climb toward 10,000 human beings packed into and around one building. William Ritchie Newton, an American historian who spent years in the archives of the Royal Buildings Administration, the office that handled every complaint about every blocked pipe and every squatter, reconstructed what daily life actually looked like behind the facade. His conclusion, roughly translated from the French, was a world where overcrowding competed with grime and nauseating smells, a good 1,000 people at any given moment fighting for a bed, for firewood, for a scrap of privacy, inside the most magnificent shell ever raised over human squalor. And the 1,000 people fighting for those beds were dukes, the oldest names in France, families who owned provinces, crammed into attic rooms the size of a modern closet, because a closet inside Versailles was worth more than a chateau anywhere else. Proximity to the king was the only currency that counted, and people paid for it with every comfort they had. A courtier might own a magnificent estate 3 days' ride away and choose instead to sleep in a partitioned box under the roof tiles, freezing in winter, baking in summer, sharing a corridor with 40 other people and one overflowing privy, all for the chance to be seen at the right moment by the right pair of royal eyes. Saint-Simon describes grown men, marshals of France, intriguing for years to move from one cramped lodging to a slightly less cramped lodging, one floor closer to the action. The palace was also, and this surprises people every time, open to the public. Anyone decently dressed could walk in. A man needed a sword to enter the state apartments, and if he didn't own one, no problem, he could rent one at the gate. Enterprising locals kept swords for hire the way airports now keep luggage trolleys. So on any given day, the corridors held not only the court, but a churning crowd of sightseers, provincial gentry come to gawk, petitioners clutching papers, pickpockets working the crush, vendors, beggars who talked their way past the guards, and women selling things that were not officially for sale on the palace staircases. A problem the administration complained about in writing more than once. Thousands of strangers every day moving through a building with essentially no public toilets. We'll get to where all those people went shortly, and the answer is exactly as bad as you're afraid it is. Night barely improved matters, since the palace after dark was an unlit maze patrolled by too few guards and inhabited by far too many people with keys. Corridors stretched away black beyond each pool of lantern light, and candles were money. Real money, the half-burned candles of the state rooms being a formal perquisite that certain officers collected and resold, an entire trade in royal candle stubs, so nobody wasted flame on a hallway. People got lost inside the building they lived in. Thieves worked the sleeping palace with real success, and the archives record burglaries of astonishing nerve, jewels lifted from locked apartments, silver vanishing from under guard, even furnishings and braids stripped from staterooms by thieves with the patience to unpick gold thread in the dark. And periodically, the Majesty of France discovered that the Majesty of France had been robbed in its own house by parties unknown who were, fairly often, residents. Between the dark, the drink, the crowding, and the total absence of anything you could call policing indoors, the after-hours palace ran on roughly the security of a fairground, and prudent courtiers slept with their valuables under the mattress and their doors bolted inside the most heavily guarded address in Europe. First, though, the water, since the water is where the dying starts. Louis XIV wanted fountains, hundreds of them, cascades and sheets of falling water across gardens that stretch to the horizon on a site that, as we've established, had no water. The ponds around Versailles were shallow and foul. The little river Bièvre was a trickle. So the king's engineers began one of the most expensive and most lethal plumbing projects in human history, and the cost of it was mostly paid by men whose names nobody bothered to record. The first great effort was the Machine de Marly, built between 1681 and 1684 on the Seine at Bougival. 14 enormous paddle wheels, each of them roughly the size of a windmill, turned by the river and driving well over 200 pumps, hauling water up a hillside about 150 meters toward the aqueduct that fed Marly and Versailles. Around 1,800 workers built it. Contemporaries called it the eighth wonder of the world, and also complained that they could hear it groaning and clanking from miles away, day and night, a constant mechanical moan hanging over the countryside. It was a marvel. It was also never enough. All that iron and timber and noise delivered a fraction of what the gardens drank, and the fountains still had to be rationed, turned on section by section as the king strolled past, with the fountain keepers whistling signals to each other ahead of the royal walking party, so that His Majesty would see water leaping everywhere he looked and never learn that it died the moment he turned his back. So the king reached further. In 1685, work began on a scheme to solve the problem forever, the Canal de l'Eure, designed by Vauban, the greatest military engineer of the age, and organized by Louvois, the king's minister of war. The idea was to capture an entire river, the Eure, some 80 kilometers away near Pont-Gouin, and walk it across the countryside to the reservoirs of Versailles, over valleys, through hills, across a colossal arcaded aqueduct at Maintenon, whose stone arches still stand today. To dig it, the crown used the army. Around 30,000 men were put on the works, and about 20,000 of them were soldiers. Whole regiments marched into the valley of the Eure and handed shovels. They dug through marshland. They dug in standing water, in trenches that filled as fast as they emptied, sleeping in camps pitched on wet ground beside the very stagnant pools they were excavating. And the fevers came for them. Malarial swamp fever, the same sickness that had always haunted that country, ripped through the work camps in 1686 and 1687. Men shook and burned in their tents by the hundred. French records speak of 6,000 soldiers and workers dying of the fever in 1687 alone, and some estimates for the whole project run to 10,000 dead, soldiers and civilians together. Other accounts describe as many as 20,000 men sick at one time before the Crown finally pulled the troops out. A modern scholarly article calls the very largest numbers a black legend that grew up around Louvois, an exaggeration stacked on a real catastrophe. And that's fair, we should say so. But even the cautious versions of this story involve regiments of the French army dying by the thousand in peacetime, digging a garden feature. Madame de Sévigné, the great letter-writer of the age, mentioned the works with a curl of the lip you can still feel 3 centuries later, marveling that a river was being turned from its path. Saint-Simon, looking back on the whole affair, called it a cruel folly. And the court at Versailles, 20 leagues away, mostly didn't think about it at all. A story circulated later, and you'll still find it repeated, that the dead were carted away from the works at night so the survivors wouldn't lose heart. No document from the time says that in so many words, so take it as the sort of detail a horror grows for itself in the retelling. What the documents do say is grim enough. The sick were quietly withdrawn, the camps emptied, and in 1688 war broke out, and the whole project was abandoned mid-dig. The canal never carried a single drop of water to Versailles. The aqueduct at Maintenon stands to this day, 47 arches of beautiful cut stone marching across the valley, a bridge for a river that never came, and depending on which estimate you believe, somewhere between 1 and 3 men died for every meter of it. The dying wasn't all exported to distant valleys either. Hard against the palace grounds lay a stretch of marsh and foul standing water known locally, with admirable directness as the Stinking Pond, and in the 1680s the king set his Swiss guards to dig it out and convert it into an ornamental lake. Regiments of soldiers, again, up to their thighs in the very water, their own century blamed for every fever it had a name for, hauling muck by the basket through summers and winters, and the tradition that came down in the town holds that the fevers of that digging killed Swiss guardsmen in numbers nobody officially counted, that men who survived alpine winters and European battlefields died draining a bog so the view from the orangerie would be nicer. The finished sheet of water was named the Pièce d'eau des Suisses, the Lake of the Swiss, and it carries that name today. 13 hectares of calm water at the foot of the gardens, officially a tribute to the men who dug it, and depending on how much weight you give the old tradition, something closer to a memorial. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the water they did manage to collect sat in open reservoirs and ornamental basins, warming in the sun, growing its green skin, breeding its mosquitoes, and seeping into the drinking supply of a town of tens of thousands. Visitors complained about the water of Versailles for 100 years. The ponds smelled in summer. The Grand Canal itself, that mile-long mirror of water at the foot of the gardens, could turn foul in the heat, and the smell drifted up the lawns toward the terraces, where the finest people in Europe took their evening air. The swamp, in other words, never really left. They paved it, gilded it, and pumped it full of fountains, and it went right on doing what swamps do. Indoors, then, to the question you've been waiting for. 10,000 people on a busy day inside one building. Where did they all go to the toilet? The honest answer has two layers, and both of them are worse than you'd like. The first layer is that Versailles had far more sanitary provision than the internet gives it credit for. The second layer is that even that provision, stretched across that many bodies, produced conditions we would struggle to walk through without gagging. Start with what existed. Public latrines had been built into the palace as far back as Louis XIII's day, at the ground floor of the south wing, roughly where the Pavillon du Four stands now. Under Louis XIV, historians have firmly located at least two public toilet installations, one behind the great ambassador's staircase and another in the galleries of the new south wing, with similar arrangements in the north wing. Beneath the building ran a network of cesspits, the Fosses des Anses, dug from the very first construction campaigns, precisely so that the courtyards and gardens would not become, in the language of the documents, a receptacle of filth. The royal family had private cabinets with close stools, chaises percées, upholstered chairs with a hole in the seat and a porcelain or silver basin underneath, and these could be objects of real luxury, covered in velvet, trimmed in gold, one of them famously done in red Morocco leather. The palace inventories count these chairs by the hundred. Most figures land somewhere between 200 and 300 close stools for the whole building, 200 or 300 seats, for a resident population in the thousands and a daily crowd that could double it. You can do that division in your head, and the courtiers did it with their bodies every day for a century. Now, the close stool at Versailles wasn't hidden away the way we hide a bathroom. For the king, it was a piece of state furniture, and attendance upon it was an honor. Louis XIV granted what was called the brevet de fer, a formal warrant entitling a select few courtiers to be present while the king sat on his pierced chair and did his business. Men paid serious money for that warrant. Great nobles competed for it. The logic ran that any moment of access to the king's person was priceless, and the king was famously relaxed on his chair, receiving officials, continuing conversations, conducting the affairs of France while conducting his own. Ambassadors were sometimes received by great lords who stayed seated on their close stools throughout the audience. The Duc de Vendôme, one of the king's most celebrated generals, took this to lengths that disgusted even his contemporaries, holding his morning receptions from his pierced chair and, per Saint-Simon, rising mid-audience to wipe himself in front of whoever happened to be standing there, including on one occasion a visiting bishop. Saint-Simon, who hated Vendôme, recorded every detail with the relish of a man handed a gift. So that was the top of the pyramid, waste disposal as theatre, gilded chairs, and paying spectators. Below the royal family and the great office holders, things fell apart fast. An ordinary courtier had a chamber pot in his lodging, if he had a lodging, and a servant to carry it, if he could afford a servant. The pot got carried down however many flights of those 67 staircases and emptied wherever was closest, into a cesspit if the servant was conscientious, into a courtyard or out a window if he wasn't, and the records of the town of Versailles are full of exactly that. Pots emptied from windows into streets and interior courts, to the point that ordinances had to forbid it repeatedly, meaning nobody obeyed the first ordinance or the second. And the visitors, the thousands of daily strangers with their rented swords, had almost nothing. A handful of public latrines, often broken, often overflowing, sometimes locked, sometimes converted to other uses. In 1741, the administration turned a privy in the attics of the North Wing into yet another lodging, because floor space was worth more than sanitation, and the paper trail survives of people in that wing thereafter relieving themselves in the public corridor, since the alternative had been removed. That incident got written down precisely as a complaint, so someone minded. But the response to minding was a memo, not a toilet. In practice, that left the building itself as the toilet. People went in the corners of galleries, on staircases, behind doors, behind curtains, behind the great marble columns, in the courtyards, against the walls of the chapel. We know this in unusual detail thanks to one woman, and she's going to be our guide through a lot of this video. Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, called Lieselotte, was a German princess married off to the king's brother, Monsieur, the Duc d'Orléans. She arrived at the French court in 1671, hated almost everything about it, and coped by writing letters home, roughly 90,000 of them across her lifetime, blunt, funny, furious letters in which she said exactly what she saw. The Château de Versailles itself, the modern institution, ranks her alongside Saint-Simon as the best surviving witness of daily life at the palace. And what she saw in 1702 was this. The people stationed in the galleries in front of her rooms, she wrote, pissed in all the corners. It was impossible, she said, to leave her apartment without seeing somebody at it. This is the sister-in-law of the Sun King, describing the view from her own front door in the most magnificent building on earth. She had views on the interior arrangements too. At Fontainebleau, another royal residence run on the same system, her rooms sat on the side of the palace without a proper close stool nearby, and she complained in writing with characteristic directness about having to hold everything in all night because a chamber pot was all she had. And in a letter from Versailles, dated the 11th of May, 1685, she describes being scolded by the king's confessor for her crude language, all her talk of crapping and pissing, and defends herself by pointing out that she'd heard the king himself say 100 times that within the family one could talk about anything at all. So the coarseness ran right to the top. These people were not delicate about bodies. They lived jammed against each other's bodies, and the vocabulary followed. Some of them stopped bothering with even minimal discretion. Saint-Simon has a portrait of the Princesse d'Harcourt, a senior lady of the court, that has to be one of the crueler paragraphs in French literature, and buried in the middle of it is the detail that she was, in his words, filthy in her habits, and would relieve herself as she walked, leaving a trail behind her that servants had to clean, and that the servants hated her for it. He presents it as a character flaw, a personal disgrace, and the framing shows where the norm sat. Most people did not do that. Most people were revolted. But she could do it, at Versailles, in company, and remain a princess in good standing at the greatest court in the world, and the floors got mopped, and life went on. The floors, in fairness, did get mopped. Louis XIV issued a standing order that the corridors and courtyards be cleared of feces once a week. A weekly schedule. The most fastidious building administration in Europe looked at the state of its own hallways and decided that a 7-day cycle of excrement removal was the achievable target. Between cleanings, the deposits accumulated where they fell in the heat of summer and the damp of winter, walked through, tracked along, ground into the parquet under thousands of silk shoes. Servants scattered the halls with orange trees in silver tubs, partly for beauty and quite openly for the smell, living air fresheners stationed along the routes the king walked. The gardeners of Versailles maintained hundreds of orange trees, and their perfume was one of the few weapons the palace had against itself. Women faced a specific engineering problem in all this, and the age solved it with a specific piece of porcelain. A court gown of the period involved layer upon layer of skirts over a boned bodice, and underneath all of it, nothing, since drawers were not yet standard wear for women. Bending or sitting in full dress was somewhere between difficult and impossible. Enter the bordeleau, a small oblong vessel, usually porcelain, shaped more or less like a gravy boat, often beautifully painted, sometimes with a little eye on the inside bottom or a cheeky motto. A lady could stand or half crouch, slide the thing beneath her skirts with the help of a maid, relieve herself more or less invisibly in the middle of a gallery or a chapel service, and hand the warm result off to be carried away. The name supposedly comes from Louis Bordeleau, a Jesuit preacher whose sermons ran so long that the ladies of the court came equipped, though historians mostly treat that story as a joke that stuck rather than a documented origin. The object itself was entirely real, manufactured by the finest porcelain houses in Europe, and museum collections are full of them. Next time you're in a decorative arts museum and you see a delicate little floral boat labeled with that name, that's what you're looking at. Somebody peed in it at a party. The Royal Chapel, while we're at it, concentrated everything we've been describing into one tall, gilded box. Daily Mass drew the whole court, packed shoulder to shoulder in full dress, the king in his tribune above, everyone else angled to watch the king rather than the altar, and services on great feasts ran for hours in a crowd of perfumed, painted, unwashed bodies pressed together under all that marble. Incense burning in clouds that served the liturgy and the nose at the same time. Ladies came provisioned, the bordelue riding under the skirts for exactly these marathons, and men slipped out to the stairwells we've already discussed, and people fainted in the crush routinely enough that nobody interrupted the music for it. The overcome simply passed hand to hand toward the doors while the choir carried on. Even holiness at Versailles happened at a density of bodies per square meter that turned every gathering into a physical ordeal, and the courtiers' fabled endurance, the ability to stand for hours in heavy dress without eating, drinking, sitting, or visibly sweating, was rehearsed in that chapel several hundred times a year. And then, moving down the food chain, the animals, because Versailles was as much a stable and a kennel as a palace. The royal stables across the square held upward of 2,000 horses, with all that 2,000 horses produce, and the smell of the stables hung over the town on the wrong wind. Inside the palace, dogs were everywhere, hunting hounds, lapdogs, the king's own dogs, whom Louis XIV fed biscuits with his own hands in his private rooms. Courtiers kept dogs, cats, monkeys, parrots, all of them living, eating, and eliminating in the same overcrowded lodgings as their owners. Liselotte, a dedicated dog lover herself, wrote frankly about her spaniels doing their business in her rooms. Cats went half feral in the attics and cellars, hunting the rats, and the rats needed hunting. A building holding that much food waste and that much general waste fed a rodent population that no one ever counted and everyone occasionally heard in the walls. When a rat died under the floorboards of a lodging, the occupant lived with the smell until it finished. Mice chewed the silk upholstery, fleas moved freely among all parties, noble and animal alike, and we're going to get to the fleas properly a little later. Stack all of this up then. The cesspits below, the corners above, the weekly mopping, the 2,000 horses, the pigs bleeding out under the minister's windows, the stagnant ponds, the crowds. What did the place actually smell like to stand in? Contemporaries tried to tell us, and their answer became the palace's second reputation, the shadow reputation that has trailed the official one down 3 centuries. Madame de Sévigné put it in one line. "The air and the smells of the court," she wrote, "are enough to turn your stomach." La Morandière, our inspector from the top of the video, put it in an itemized list: the urine, the fecal matter, the pig blood, the standing water, the cat corpses. A 19th century doctor named Augustin Cabanès went digging through old papers for his books on the intimate habits of the past, reprinted La Morandière's report in 1908, and from there it passed into Alain Corbin's famous History of Smell, and from Corbin into every article you've ever skimmed about how Versailles reeked. So when you hear that claim, know that it rests on real, quotable, contemporary testimony filtered through a couple of centuries of authors who each enjoyed the horror a little more than the last. The reek was real, the relish is modern. What the court did about the reek amounted to chemical warfare. Perfume at Versailles was armor, and it was medicine. The physicians of the age taught that disease travelled in foul air, in miasmas, corrupt invisible vapours rising off filth and marsh and sick bodies, and that a strong, pleasant scent neutralised the danger in foul air outright. To surround yourself with fragrance was to purify the air entering your lungs. So the court drenched itself on doctors' orders, and the palace of the Sun King became known across Europe as the Perfumed Court, La Cour Parfumée, a title it wore with pride and earned in self-defense. The scale of it beggars belief. Gloves came perfumed, since the leather tanning process left them smelling of exactly what leather tanning involves, and a whole guild, the glovers' perfumers, existed at the intersection of those two facts. Fans were perfumed, wigs were powdered with scented starch, handkerchiefs, writing paper, rosaries, the little sponges people carried to press against their noses in a crowd. Furniture was scented, rooms were fumigated with burning pastils, and courtiers wore pomanders, pierced metal balls packed with ambergris and civet and musk, swinging from their waists like censers. Take a moment on those ingredients actually, since the age's idea of a beautiful smell came from remarkably dark places. Ambergris is a waxy secretion from the digestive tract of sperm whales, harvested off beaches after years at sea. Civet is scraped from the anal glands of a live civet cat, an animal kept caged for the purpose. Musk came from a gland cut out of a dead deer. The loveliest ladies of Versailles moved in a cloud built from whale bile and cat gland, and considered it the height of refinement, and honestly, given the competition in the hallway, it probably was. Under Louis XV, the habit reached its peak. Accounts from his reign describe a king who demanded a different perfume for his apartments every day of the week. Fragrant waters splashing in indoor fountains, flowers banked in every room and thrown out the moment they wilted. His mistress, Madame de Pompadour, ran a perfume bill that sources put at 100,000 livres a year, and some accounts run far higher, a sum that would have kept a provincial noble family in comfort for a generation, spent annually on smelling nice. One countess became famous for her perfumed garters. An abbé at court was said to have ruined himself financially on violet powder alone, and I want you to hold that image, a man of the church, bankrupt, standing in a cloud of violets he could no longer afford. The great Parisian perfume houses, Fargen, Lubin, Aubigant, names some of which still exist, built their fortunes supplying this one building. Marie Antoinette, at the end of the line, took a different route through the same landscape, and her example starts to bend the story somewhere new. Her personal perfumer, Jean-Louis Fargeon, created scents for her built on the flowers of her gardens at Trianon, lighter, greener, less of the whale and the cat. And she bathed, regularly, by the standards of any century, in a slipper-shaped tub, wearing a long flannel chemise buttoned to the neck even in the water, since full nudity in the bath still carried a whiff of indecency. One account describes a preparation her people called the bath of modesty, the water softened with lavender and lemon, the queen seated on a cushion stuffed with linseed and marshmallow root and lily bulb and sweet almond, scrubbing herself with muslin sachets of bran. Her attendants recorded her as exceptionally clean in her person, almost strangely so by court standards. Attitudes were moving by the 1770s and 80s. The obvious question, the one this whole subject turns on, is why they ever needed to move. Why did the richest people on the planet, people who could afford anything, go generations without washing in water? Their doctors told them water could kill them. The doctors had a theory, the theory had a history, and for about 200 years the entire educated culture of Europe believed it. The theory went like this. The skin, physicians taught, was a porous barrier, and hot water opened those pores wide. Through opened pores, the corrupt air we just talked about, the plague-bearing miasma, could pour directly into the body's interior. Bathing, especially hot bathing, was therefore an act of recklessness, a voluntary lowering of your body's drawbridge in a world under permanent siege by invisible poison. This idea crystallized during the Great Plague epidemics of the 14th through 16th centuries. Medieval Europe, and people are often surprised by this, had been rather fond of bathing. Paris alone had 26 public bathhouses at the end of the 1200s, steam baths, hot tubs, a whole social culture of communal washing. The plague years killed all of it. The bathhouses were blamed for spreading contagion, shut down and demolished. And by the 15 and 1600s, a physician could write with complete confidence that baths were dangerous to health, and everyone nodded, and that consensus was still fully in force when Versailles was built. The consequences reached down to infancy. A newborn's first wash after birth might be the last full-body wash of childhood, with the next immersion delayed for years. Louis XIII, the man whose hunting lodge started all this, is a documented case, since the journal of his childhood physician survives, and it records that the boy's legs were washed for the first time when he was 6 years old. 6. A prince of France, the heir to the throne, tended by the finest medical establishment in Europe, and that establishment's considered position was that his legs should not touch wash water for his first 6 years of life, for his own protection. So if water was off the table, what did being clean mean? And the age had a confident answer, since these people absolutely considered themselves clean, cleaner than their ancestors, cleaner than the peasantry, models of refinement. Cleanliness lived in linen. The white shirt, the chemise worn against the skin under everything else, was believed to draw sweat, oil and impurity out of the body the way a wick draws oil, and changing that linen was washing. A fresh white shirt made you clean, in the medicine of the day, actively and truly. Charles Perrault, the man who wrote down Cinderella, stated the doctrine outright in 1688, that the cleanliness of our linen and the abundance we have of it is worth more than all the baths in the world. Wealth in shirts became a form of hygiene. Aristocratic inventories of the period average about 30 shirts per gentleman. Molière died owning 30, Racine owned 30, and a truly fastidious man changed his shirt daily or more. The visible inch of blinding white at the collar and cuffs advertised to the world that the body underneath was pure. The body underneath had, in many cases, not touched water in years, and was managed instead by rubbing, dry toweling with cloths, wiping the face and hands, the occasional going over with vinegar or spirits. Note, too, what the linen doctrine quietly excluded: everything worn over the shirt. The silks, the velvets, the brocades, the embroidered coats stiff with gold thread, and the court gowns that cost as much as a farm. None of it could be washed at all. ever. Water and soap being fatal to the fabrics and the metallic embroidery alike. Outer clothing was brushed, aired, spot scrubbed with fuller's earth, hung in the smoke of burning perfumes, and worn on, year after year, decade after decade, a great gala costume passing through a career of sweated ballrooms and august ceremonies, and acquiring, in the linings and under the arms, a biography no brushing could remove. Garments outlived their owners and went on working, handed down to heirs, passed to servants as wages in kind, sold into the enormous second-hand clothing trade that dressed half of Paris, and each transfer moved the previous owner's residue and the previous owner's lice to a new address. A courtier in full fig at Versailles stood inside layers of fabric of very different ages. A fresh white shirt of this morning wrapped in outer splendor that might predate his birth, cleaned in its entire existence by nothing stronger than a brush and a prayer. And when he raised his arms to dance, the room was reminded of every summer that coat had ever seen. Louis XIV's own morning routine ran on exactly this system, and we know it hour by hour since his rising was a public ceremony with an audience. His valet and his physician rubbed him down, often changing his shirt mid-ceremony since the king sweated heavily. His hands got a rinse in spirits of wine, alcohol, on a fine plate held by a courtier whose whole office was the holding of that plate. His face wiped, his body toweled and re-shirted and perfumed, though the story goes that heavy perfume gave this particular king headaches in his later years, leaving him one of the least scented men in his own scented palace, the eye of his own aromatic hurricane. That morning routine, by the way, played to a full house, and no other spectacle of the age put a human body on display at such close range, so walk through it with me. The king's rising, the lever, was a ticketed ceremony in everything but the paper, with 6 waves of admission ranked by privilege, and upward of 100 men could pass through the bedchamber on a good morning to watch the king be extracted from his bed and assembled for the day. The first arrivals caught the intimate stage, the king still in bed, then rising, then on his pierced chair if the timing ran that way, the chair sitting right in the room, and the schedule being the schedule. Wave by wave they watched him rubbed down, shaved every second day by his barber before the crowd, wigged, for almost nobody outside a tiny inner circle ever saw the king's bare head. A short wig handed to him through the bed curtains before he so much as emerged, dressed piece by piece by officers whose entire careers consisted of the right sleeve or the left, and the honor of handing the king his shirt was calibrated to the millimeter of rank, princes of the blood-first refusal, a warming of the shirt before the fire on cold mornings, gloved and ungloved protocols, grown men furious over decades about who held linen. At day's end the whole liturgy ran in reverse at the coucher, the undressing, the crowd again, and the final honor of the evening, holding the candlestick while the king got into bed, awarded nightly by the king himself to one favored gentleman, a mark of favor men schemed for months to receive. One flame held for 5 minutes next to a bed, and dukes measured their standing by it. All of it meant that the royal body, its sweats, its smells, its bad mouth, its chair, was the most closely observed object in France, seen daily at arm's length by hundreds, and that every detail in that medical journal had a live audience when it happened. Privacy was for lesser men. The King of France was raised, watered, and stabled in public like a sacred animal, and he had designed it that way on purpose, since a nobility busy fighting over his shirt was a nobility too busy to fight him. And now the big claim, the one everybody has heard, that Louis XIV bathed twice in his life, or 3 times, depending on who's telling it. Where you land on that one depends on which pile of evidence you weigh heavier, so here are both piles, and you can sort it out yourself. On one side, the medical record, his physician's journal, and we'll be spending a lot more time inside that document shortly. Records baths as notable medical events, prescribed occasionally, undertaken with preparation and caution, a purge beforehand, careful management after, the way you document a minor procedure. Bathing for pleasure or routine washing simply doesn't appear as a habit, and the 2 baths figure seems to descend from counting those rare prescribed immersions in his adult medical file. On the other side, the building itself. The ground floor of Versailles contained a full appartement des bains, a suite of bathing rooms begun in 1671 and fitted out across the following decade at colossal expense. Marble everywhere, 80,000 livres worth of stonework, and at its center an octagonal tub carved from a single block of Reims marble, 3 meters across, deep enough to sit several people, costing 15,000 livres on its own. That tub still exists. You can go and stand next to it. The suite had hot and cold running water from a dedicated boiler system, and it connected, not by accident, to the orbit of Madame de Montespan, the king's great mistress of those years. Since the bathing apartment served pleasures beyond hygiene, a warm, private, perfumed place where the king entertained. He also swam in rivers for fun, especially in his younger years, at Conflans, in a long grey bathing gown, with courtiers splashing around him. So, a man with a marble bathing palace and a taste for swimming, whose doctors logged perhaps a couple of therapeutic baths across his adult life, in an age when their absence was the mark of a careful man. Both of those things sit in the record together. What you call that, washed or unwashed, is genuinely up to you. His successors drifted back toward the water, slowly. Louis XV kept private bathing rooms and used them, though he trusted river water over piped, holding the old opinion that water agitated by movement was purer, and he still took the precautionary purge before immersion, since you don't shake off 2 centuries of medical dread in one reign. After 1740, a new piece of furniture starts turning up in aristocratic inventories, the bidet, politely catalogued as the cleanliness chair, and its slow spread through the great houses of France marks, fixture by fixture, the return of the idea that water belonged on the body. By Marie Antoinette's day, as we saw, a queen could bathe daily in her buttoned flannel chemise, on her cushion of marshmallow root, and be admired for it rather than worried over. All of that, though, is the body's surface. The court had guests living closer in than the dirt, and it's time to talk about them. Every head at Versailles, from the kings down to the scullery boys, hosted or had recently hosted lice. That was simply the baseline of 17th century life, at every level of society, and the court's most famous fashion statement grew directly out of it, along with a couple of other embarrassments nobody put on the portraits. The great wig, the towering periwig cascading over the shoulders of every grandee of the age, traces back to a bald young man. Louis XIII began losing his hair in his early 20s, startlingly early, around 1624, and covered the loss with false hair. And since he was the king, false hair immediately became magnificent rather than pitiable. His son inherited both the throne and, in time, the thinning, and raised the wig into an institution, employing dozens of wig makers, appearing in public exclusively under mountains of curled horsehair and human hair, and his cousin Charles II carried the fashion across to England within a few years. Behind the vanity sat something grimmer. Hair loss in that era had a reputation attached, since the standard treatment for syphilis was mercury, and mercury makes hair fall out, so a bare scalp on a man of a certain age invited a certain assumption, and both of those kings, whispered contemporaries and modern historians alike have noted, may well have had personal reasons to mind the assumption. A big wig ended the conversation before it started. It also, conveniently, ended a different conversation, the one with the lice. A gentleman under a full wig generally shaved his head or cropped it to stubble, and a shaved head gave head lice nothing to hold. The lice relocated into the wig itself naturally, but a wig, unlike a scalp, could be sent out. Wig makers offered boiling and delousing as routine maintenance. Drop your hair off Tuesday, collect it Thursday, parasite-free, freshly curled and powdered. Michael Quass, a historian who studied the trade, tracked the number of master wig makers in Paris from 200 in 1673 to more than 900 a century later. An entire industrial sector floated in part on outsourced lice management. The powder that finished the look, wheat starch and rice flour scented with musk or orange flower, whitened the hair, absorbed the grease, and perfumed the head, 3 problems in one puff, and left the great galleries of Versailles hazed with drifting flour whenever the court assembled, dusting the shoulders of every coat in the room. The parasites lower down had no such solution. Body lice lived in the seams of clothing, fleas lived everywhere, and the age fought them with gadgets and accessories rather than washing. Long-handled scratching rods, some of ivory, some disguised as fashionable little canes, let a lady reach an itch under the full architecture of a court gown without dismantling herself. Small, perforated cylinders called flea traps hung on ribbons under the clothes, baited inside with a scrap of cloth dabbed in blood or honey, on the theory that the flea would hop in for the bait and stay. Fur pieces were carried partly in the hope that fleas would prefer the fur to the person. None of it worked especially well, and everyone scratched, elegantly, constantly, and a really committed flea could survive the fall of a dynasty. Under Louis XVI, the court actually named a fashionable colour after the animal, puce, French for flea, a brownish purple said to match the creature, with connoisseurs distinguishing the shade of the flea's back from the shade of its belly, and that little joke could only come from people on intimate terms with the reference. The faces above the collars were their own hazard. Court cosmetics started from a base of ceruse, a brilliant white paint compounded from vinegar and a poisonous heavy metal, layered on thick to produce the fashionable pallor, and the metal in it ate the skin underneath, raising blemishes and scars that required, in turn, more ceruse, a subscription model for slow poisoning. Over years it could loosen teeth and hair. On top of the white went rouge, in enormous quantities, the great ladies of Versailles wearing 2 flaming discs of red that foreign visitors found frankly alarming. And dotted around the composition went the mouches, little black silk patches shaped as stars and hearts and crescents, extremely witty, extremely coded, and doing double duty as covers for smallpox pits and syphilis marks and cirrhosis damage. A fully finished court face was a painted screen over a landscape you were not supposed to ask about. Underneath it all, teeth were rotting, since sugar had arrived in Europe as a luxury, and the rich ate it in quantities their dentistry could not answer for. Sunken, toothless mouths were so ordinary among the aging elite that the fashion adjusted around them, and breath across a card table at Versailles must have been a genuine test of courtly composure. The king's own mouth, as you're about to hear, was among the worst in the building. Because now we have to talk about the body of Louis XIV, really talk about it. And we can do that at a level of detail available for almost no other human being of his century, thanks to a single extraordinary document. From 1647 until 1711, his personal physicians kept the Journal de la Santé du Roi, the Journal of the King's Health, a continuous daily medical log of one man's body across 64 years. Every fever, every purge, every bowel movement of consequence, every extraction and incision, examined, recorded, discussed. The king's stool was inspected daily and its qualities noted in writing, and the state of the royal digestion was, without exaggeration, a matter of government record. Taken as a whole, the journal describes a man of tremendous natural constitution being systematically demolished, decade by decade, half by his appetites and half by his doctors, and it spares nothing, so neither will we. Begin with the food going in, since the food explains a lot of what follows. Louis XIV ate on a scale that astonished people whose whole lives were spent around heavy eaters. Lieselotte, our German correspondent, watched him at table and sent home an inventory. She had often seen the king, she wrote, consume 4 full plates of different soups, an entire pheasant, a partridge, a big plate of salad, 2 thick slices of ham, mutton in garlic gravy, a plateful of pastries, and then fruit and hard-boiled eggs on top, in one sitting, regularly. When his body was opened after death, the physicians reported his stomach and bowels ran twice the volume of an ordinary man's, and his appetite made more sense to them in hindsight. Reports from the autopsy also mention worms in his gut, a tapeworm by some accounts, a co-diner nobody had invited, though with intestinal worms being near universal in that century, the king was in that one respect perfectly average. Against that intake, set his teeth, or rather, the lack of them. A lifelong passion for candied fruit and sweetmeats, plus the general state of the art, rotted the royal teeth early and thoroughly, and by his mid-40s they were mostly gone, pulled one by one as they abscessed. Then, in 1685, came the extraction that went wrong in a way dental students still get told about. Working on the infected teeth of the king's upper left jaw, his operators tore out, along with the teeth, a chunk of the jawbone and palate itself, punching a permanent hole between the king's mouth and his sinus and nasal cavity. The consequences were immediate and grotesque. When the king drank, The liquid could travel up through the hole and pour out of his nose. The journal and contemporary medical accounts describe wine spouting from the royal nostrils like a little fountain, at table in company. For the rest of his life, a possibility every sip had to negotiate. Worse, food worked its way up into the cavity and lodged there, out of reach, and rotted inside his skull, an inaccessible pocket of decay that made his breath, by multiple polite and impolite accounts, appalling, and Liselotte, typically, said so plainly from her seat nearby. His doctor's answer to the hole was the standard answer of 17th century surgery to most soft tissue problems: fire. They cauterized the wound with a glowing iron, pressed into the roof of the living king's mouth, and they did it over a dozen times across repeated sessions, the smell of his own burning palate in his nose each time. No anesthetic, since anesthesia was 160 years away. The king sat in a chair and let them do it, session after session, and the hole never fully closed anyway. He was in his 40s. He would live 3 more decades with that mouth, eating those meals, 4 soups and a pheasant at a time, everything swallowed essentially unchewed, and his digestion, unsurprisingly, became the other great running theme of the medical journal, a 60-year war of indigestion, gout, gas, and heroic quantities of purging, and purging at this court was a whole culture, so it gets the full tour. The medicine of the age rested on the ancient idea of humours, 4 fluids in the body whose balance was health and whose imbalance was disease, and the physician's job was rebalancing by taking things out of the patient. Bleeding took from the veins, emetics took from the stomach, and the clyster, the enema, took from below, and of the 3, the clyster was the crowd favourite, the gentle one, the one you could build a lifestyle around, and the French court absolutely built a lifestyle around it. Louis XIV received, over the course of his life, more than 2,000 enemas. 2,000. The figure comes from the medical journal, where they were logged as routinely as meals, sometimes several in a week, warm water and herbs, or milk, or honeyed decoctions, administered by a specialist officer of the bedchamber with a brass syringe nearly the length of a forearm. The king took them as maintenance, as prevention, as cure, and as preparation for everything from baths to journeys, and he was so entirely unbothered by the procedure that he sometimes received courtiers and continued the business of the day, while the business of the clyster proceeded under his robes. Contemporaries record him rising from the operation and rejoining his evening company, refreshed, a monarch topped up. The court calendar itself bent around the royal bowels, days on which the king took physic. The purge days were marked in the rhythm of the palace, ceremonies trimmed, audiences shuffled. The whole schedule of the French state adjusted around a planned evacuation, and courtiers tracked the king's medicine days the way farmers track weather, since a purged king kept to his rooms, and a king in his rooms changed everybody's mourning. Bulletins on the results circulated among the people whose business was knowing, and Saint-Simon and the letter-writers pass along the state of the royal digestion as court news, in the same paragraphs as marriages and disgraces, with no sense whatever that the 2 categories differed in dignity. A modern reader flinches at a duchess relaying the quality of the king's motions to a friend in the country. Nobody then flinched. The king's body was the state's interior was reported on like a province, and the doctors filing those reports were, in the most exact sense, ministers of the interior. His father before him had been even more dedicated. The medical ledger of Louis XIII's physician survives for one representative year, and in that single year the king absorbed 212 enemas, 215 purgative drafts, and 47 bleedings. Divide that by 365, and the picture resolves. This was every day or two, forever. A childhood and adulthood spent being drained and flushed to a calendar by men in black robes who billed for it, and he died at 41 of an intestinal ailment his moderns diagnose, with some irony, as likely worsened by the treatment. At court, the fashion trickled down and became a craze. Fashionable Parisians of quality took 3 or 4 lavements a day, as casually as coffee, and the apothecaries competed on luxury, tinting the fluids pleasant colors, scenting them with rose, with orange blossom, with angelica, so that one's interior might be as perfumed as one's exterior. Special syringes were manufactured with modesty plates, and curved models allowed a lady of resolve to manage the affair alone. Saint-Simon records the young Duchesse de Bourgogne, the darling of the old king's final years, chatting with the king before the theatre, while, beneath her gown, her maid crouched administering a clyster, the Duchess carrying on the conversation without a flicker, holding the dose through the entertainment to take effect afterward. The king found out and was more amused than scandalized. Everyone was doing it. Servants attending on great nobles were, by one account, expected to take a daily enema themselves, so that no inconvenient urge would call them away from duty. Grooming the staff at Versailles went that far in. All of this flushing and purging framed the royal body as a machine to be drained, and mostly the drainage was routine. In 1685, the year of the ruined palate, the machine developed a fault in a place that all the syringes in France could not fix, and the story of that fault became one of the most consequential episodes in the history of surgery, and one of the most excruciating things ever voluntarily endured by a head of state. It started in January as a swelling near the base of the king's spine, a tenderness in the saddle region that made riding uncomfortable, then sitting uncomfortable, then everything uncomfortable. By February, it had matured into an abscess, a hot pocket of infection, deep in the flesh beside the rectum, and by May the abscess had done what untreated abscesses in that location do, tunneled, eroding a channel through the tissue until it connected the infected cavity to the bowel itself. An anal fistula. The physicians confirmed the geography with a test of beautiful, horrible simplicity, injecting a tinted infusion of St. John's wort into the external opening and watching the color emerge from the king's anus. The channel was proven. Now the problem, since a fistula will not heal on its own. It weeps, it leaks, it reinfects, and matter passes through it that should never pass through flesh, and the King of France now sat, stood, rode, danced, and reigned around a suppurating tunnel in his perineum, in constant pain that the whole apparatus of etiquette required him to show nothing of. They tried everything short of the knife first. Poultices, compresses, purges beyond counting, mineral waters. At one point, the searing iron again, cauterization attempted somewhere no iron should go, without success, and without anesthesia. When all of it failed, the case passed from the physicians, the gentleman of theory, to a barber surgeon, a member of the trade the physicians looked down on, a man named Charles-François Félix. And Félix made a request that says a great deal about him. He asked the king for 6 months. He had never performed this operation. Nobody had, in any standardized way, and a king's body was no place to learn. Arrangements were made, quietly, through the hospitals of Paris, and Félix was supplied with practice patients, poor men, prisoners, men from the countryside, some 75 of them by the commonly cited count, men who had fistulas, or in some tellings men who merely might do. And he operated on them one after another through the summer and autumn of 1686, refining his technique, refining his instruments, learning by cutting. How many of them died of it is a question the sources answer in fragments, and the fragments are ugly. Several deaths are generally accepted. One account, preserved in the medical literature, claims that among a group of these practice patients only a single man survived. And in the town of Versailles, a tradition holds that the dead from these rehearsals were buried at first light, without ceremony, with the church bells kept silent, so that no ringing would remind anyone to ask who had died, and of what, and for whom. Take the exact figures with caution, since this is exactly the corner of a story where legend pools. What stands without dispute is that unknowing, unconsenting poor men were operated on in series, so that a king's surgery would go smoothly, that some of them did not survive the favor, and that no monument anywhere carries their names. Out of those months, Félix brought 2 purpose-built instruments, a long scalpel with a curved blade, and a retractor to hold the wound open, and the scalpel acquired a name, the bistouri à la royale, the royal knife. Both instruments still exist. You can see them at Versailles, in a case, small and clean and unremarkable until you know the biography. The morning of the 18th of November, 1686. The King's bedchamber. In attendance, Madame de Maintenon, his secret wife, his confessor, his minister Louvois, and the medical men. No anesthetic existed, so none was given. The king was positioned on the edge of the bed, and Félix went in with the royal knife and laid the fistula open, cutting the tunnel apart through the muscle of the living conscious king, so that it could heal as an open wound from the bottom up, the only cure surgery had. The accounts agree that Louis endured it almost silently. Some say he gripped the bed and let slip a single exclamation, "My God," and nothing further, no cry, no struggle, and an hour afterward he submitted to a bleeding, as if the morning had contained nothing unusual. Within days, he insisted on holding court from the bed. Healing brought more cutting, since the wound closed badly, and on the 6th, 8th and 10th of December, Felix went back in with scissors to reopen and trim it. 3 further sessions on wounded, unhealed flesh. And again the king took it without complaint, and by January 1687 he was pronounced cured, and he lived another 28 years, and the fistula never returned. Felix was made rich on the spot, rewarded with a fortune in gold, an estate in the country, and a noble title, figures in the accounts running to hundreds of thousands of livres, more than most surgeons then earned in several lifetimes. The story goes that his own health paid the balance, that his hand shook ever afterward, and that he never performed the operation again. The operation itself, meanwhile, became fashionable, and this may be the most Versailles fact in this entire video. Courtiers, learning that the king had a fistula, decided that they wanted one too. The surgeon Dionys recorded, with visible exhaustion, more than 30 gentlemen presenting themselves and requesting the grand operation, several of them possessing no fistula whatsoever, disappointed to be turned away, since to be cut where the king was cut, bandaged where the king was bandaged, would have been the ultimate accessory, and 1686 passed into court memory as the year of the fistula, with the wits composing songs about the royal backside that the king, reportedly, rather enjoyed. The nation, or at least the nation's official organs, celebrated the healed royal bottom with entirely straight faces. Te Deums of thanksgiving were sung in the churches, medals were considered, and the demoiselles of Saint-Cyr, the school Madame de Maintenon had founded for poor noble girls, greeted the recovering king with a hymn composed for the occasion, music by Lully, words begging God to save the king, and a tradition impossible now to pin down and cheerfully repeated for 3 centuries, holds that this very tune travelled across the Channel decades later and became the melody of God Save the King. Follow the thread of that story at your own risk, since musicologists have been arguing about it since the 1700s. But the image it offers is too good to leave out. The British national anthem, on this telling, descending in a direct line from a choir of schoolgirls, thanking heaven for the successful surgery on a French king's anal fistula. Some legends earn their keep whether or not they can produce their paperwork. While we're on the subject of the royal body and other people's diseases, one ceremony put the king's hands directly onto the open sores of his subjects, by design, thousands at a time. French kings were held to possess a healing touch, inherited with the crown, effective against scrofula, a tubercular infection of the lymph nodes that erupts through the neck in swollen, ulcerating, weeping lumps. On the great feast days, Easter above all, sufferers converged on the court from across the kingdom, and Louis XIV would work down the line of them for hours, pressing his bare hand to each diseased neck, tracing a cross on it, pronouncing the formula, "The king touches you, God heals you." On a single Easter, he might touch 1,600 people, 1,600 infected, suppurating throats under one royal palm in an afternoon, each pilgrim also receiving a silver coin, and afterward the king rinsed his hands in the usual mixture of water and vinegar and spirits, and went to dinner. He performed this his whole reign, into old age, with the ruined mouth and the healed fistula and the gout, laying hands on the sick of France, while his own physicians could do so little for anyone. Say what you like about the man, he never shirked that particular duty, and it must have taken a stomach. Dinner, since I've mentioned it, was its own daily spectacle of magnificence and mild danger, and the mechanics of feeding this palace say as much about the place as the plumbing does. The king's food was cooked nearly a kilometre from his table. The main kitchen sat in the Grand Commune, a massive service building across the street from the palace proper, and every dish travelled from there through open air, across a road, into the palace, up the stairs, and down the corridors in a formal procession called the Viande du Roi, the king's meat. An officer marching ahead crying the words, guards falling in behind, courtiers in the corridors required to doff their hats and bow to the food as it passed. To a tureen of soup. The soup received the honours of a prince and arrived after its quarter-hour parade through the drafts of November, stone cold. Nearly everything did. The most elaborate cuisine in Europe, prepared by brigades of the finest cooks alive, was eaten lukewarm at best by the man it was all for, garnished with congealing sauces, and the poorest labourer in the town, eating pottage straight off his own fire, ate hotter food than the King of France on most nights of the year. Cold was the least of it. Every dish bound for the royal mouth was tasted or touched with bread that was then eaten by a chain of officers guarding against poison, each test adding minutes and fingers. The dishes stood uncovered on buffets while ceremony ground forward. Flies attended every course in a building above cesspits, in summer heat, in an age before anyone connected flies to anything. Sauces sat for hours. Cream stood in warm rooms. Nobody understood a germ, so nothing was managed except Splendor and the aftermath, the gripes and fluxes and vomiting that swept through court society continuously, was chalked up to imbalanced humours and treated, of course, with the syringe. What everyone drank with all this completes the picture. The water of Versailles, as established, came off stagnant reservoirs and dubious wells, and the sensible classes treated plain water as a hazard, cutting it with wine or skipping it for wine outright, adults and children alike drinking fermented safety at every meal without knowing that the alcohol was doing the sanitation. The king's table drew on the best sauces available and iced its drinks from snow and winter ice stored in deep icehouse pits in the gardens, harvested off the very ornamental ponds we've discussed, packed in straw and served back to the court all summer. Pond water in solid form cooling the royal wine, and the flavour of the ice was remarked on by exactly nobody, since the alternative was warm. Then the leftovers, and the leftovers are a story on their own. The royal table was laid every day with dozens of dishes the king would never touch, abundance as propaganda, and what came back uneaten did not go to waste. It went to the Cerdo, the office that received the remains of the royal table, and from there it was sold. Openly, formally, at stalls near the palace, the half-carved pheasants and once dipped into ragouts of the king's dinner retailed to the public, and respectable people of the town of Versailles bought and served food that had already been to court, second-hand cuisine with royal provenance, and the trade was so established that it had its own economy of regulars, resellers, and prices. Nothing at Versailles was ever thrown away while somebody further down would pay for it, and the king's garbage fed the town in a chain of hands and hours and unrefrigerated August afternoons that does not bear much thinking about. The king, meanwhile, ate his cold pheasant in public, and I mean fully in public. The ceremony of the grand couvert seated the royal family at table before an audience. Courtiers ranked around the room, and beyond them a shuffling file of ordinary sightseers. Anyone decently dressed, remember, admitted to walk through and watch the king chew. Louis XIV performed this most evenings of his life and seemed to draw strength from it, working through his courses with those absent teeth, gumming his way through 4 soups under the gaze of strangers, eating almost everything with his fingers, since he distrusted the newfangled fork and mostly declined to use one, the most refined man in Europe eating garlic mutton by hand, while a queue from the provinces filed past murmuring. His successors had less appetite for the audience. Louis XV escaped to private suppers whenever ceremony allowed. By the 1780s, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette endured the public table only on Sundays, the king eating heartily because he always ate heartily, the queen barely touching anything, hating the exposure, keeping her gloves on, waiting for it to end, while the crowd filed past all the same, watching a woman not eat, since watching was the point, and always had been. The palace that put dining and defecation on public display drew the line, interestingly, at dying. Death was the one bodily function etiquette refused to look at. The presence of a corpse, or even of the visibly dying, was held to be an affront to the majesty of the king's residence. So courtiers who fell mortally ill were removed, bundled into carriages, jolted down the avenue to die in the town or on the road, whole final hours spent in transit for protocol's sake. When Madame de Pompadour, the most powerful woman in France for 2 decades, died inside the palace in 1764 at 42, worn out and coughing blood, her death in the king's house was itself a mark of extraordinary favour, an exception nobody else got. And even for her, the rule reasserted itself within hours, her body carried out almost immediately on a stretcher, before the palace had finished absorbing the news. Louis XV watched the little cortege take her away down the avenue in a hard rain, from a balcony, since etiquette also forbade him attending, and said to his valet with tears on his face, "The marquise has bad weather for her journey." Then he went back inside. Nothing more happened and nothing more needed to, and I've never needed anyone to explain why people remember it. The building was hard on the living in quieter ways too, and one winter showed exactly how hard. 1709 brought the coldest weather in centuries to Europe, the Great Frost. Weeks of cold so severe that rivers froze solid, livestock died standing, and people froze to death in their beds across France by the thousand. Versailles, that vast lattice of glass and marble and heroic ceilings, was built for spectacle, and heat fled it through every window and flew. The 1,200 fireplaces roared and lost. Courtiers attended ceremonies wrapped in furs over their silks, faces painted, feet numb. Liselotte wrote home from the heart of it that she was sitting by a roaring fire, with a screen and furs about her, and still shaking with cold, unable to hold her pen properly, and at the king's own supper table, at the height of the ceremony of the most magnificent court on earth, the wine and water froze in the glasses as they sat. Ice in the king's glass, at the king's table, with the king watching. In the town beyond the gates, and in Paris, the poor died of that winter in numbers, and grain failed, and the year turned into famine, and the palace glittered on through it, cold inside its own walls, its residents dying of chest complaints at rates the parish registers quietly recorded. 2 years after that winter, disease came for the dynasty itself, and what it did to the royal family between 1711 and 1712 stands among the most complete demolitions of a ruling house ever accomplished without a single enemy soldier. The sanitized word has survived better than the reality, so first, the disease itself. Smallpox began as fever and crushing backache, and then the rash came, spots hardening into blisters, blisters filling with pus, and in the severe confluent form the pustules multiplied until they merged, sheeting the face and body in a continuous crust, the skin essentially cooking off the person while they lived. The eyes swelling shut, the throat lining erupting so that swallowing became agony, the smell of the sick room becoming something attendants remembered for the rest of their lives. Survivors carried melted scarring forever, and many went blind. A third or more of the infected didn't survive at all. This thing moved through crowded Versailles the way fire moves through a hayloft, and no crowd in Europe was more crowded. In April 1711, it reached the Grand Dauphin, the king's only legitimate son, the heir, a stolid, hunting madman of 49 called Monseigneur, living at his chateau of Meudon just up the road. The infection is said to have come to him through a priest who had been at the bedside of a smallpox case and then attended the prince. Monseigneur took the fever, broke out, seemed for a few days to rally, and the court began composing its congratulations. On the 14th of April he suffocated, drowned by his own erupted throat, so suddenly that the crowd of courtiers at Meudon bolted for their carriages within the hour, terror of contagion trampling 50 years of manners flat. His body corrupted at such speed, in an age that expected weeks of lying in state, that it was sealed up and hurried to Saint-Denis with a plainness that shocked people, the heir of France disposed of nearly like a plague victim, since that is precisely what he was. The crown's future now rested on Monseigneur's son, the Duc de Bourgogne, and on the Duke's wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, and what happened next broke the old king in half. Marie Adélaïde had arrived from Savoy as a bride of 11, a bright, warm, irreverent girl, and she had grown into the one person on earth who could make the old king genuinely happy, teasing him, sitting on the arm of his chair, breaking every rule of etiquette to general delight, the acknowledged son of the aging Sun King's private life. Saint-Simon, who liked almost nobody, adored her. In February 1712 she took a fever, with an aching jaw, then a rash, called measles by the doctors, and the machinery of medicine engaged. She was bled from the arm, bled from the foot, given emetics, given opium, bled once more as she weakened, her body's resources drained pint by the men fighting hardest to save her, and on the 12th of February, at 26 years old, she died at Versailles. The king was shattered in a way no one had ever witnessed in him, and the disease was already inside her husband. The Duc de Bourgogne had refused to leave her bedside through the whole illness, breathing her air day and night, and by her funeral he was spotted and burning. Grief and infection worked on him together, and the doctors bled him too, naturally, and 6 days after his wife, on the 18th of February, at Marly, he died at 29. Husband and wife, Dauphin and Dauphine of France, for less than a year between them, were carried to Saint-Denis together and set in the same vault in a single ceremony, and the court poet had material for a generation. They left 2 little boys. Within days, both broke out in the rash. The elder, the Duc de Bretagne, 5 years old, and now, for a few weeks, the 3rd Dauphin of France in a single year, received the full treatment his rank commanded, the finest physicians, which in 1712 meant the lancet, and they bled him, a feverish 5-year-old, repeatedly, opening his small veins to correct his humours as he sank, and on the 8th of March he died. And it is very hard, at this distance, not to conclude that the medicine finished what the sickness started. The younger boy was 2. His name was Louis, and every physician in the palace was ready to save him in exactly the same manner, and at that point his governess committed the most consequential act of insubordination in French history. The Duchesse de Ventadour took the feverish toddler, locked herself and a few nursery women in her apartments with him, and refused the doctors the door, and refused the bleeding and the emetics along with them. She kept him warm, kept him fed on what a sick 2-year-old would take, and simply nursed him day after day, while the medical establishment protested outside. The child sweated through his fever, spotted, scabbed, healed, and lived. He would reign for 59 years as Louis XV, and he never forgot her, embracing her publicly decades later as Maman. And the plain fact at the middle of all this is that in 1712, the single most effective medical intervention available at the court of France was a woman with the nerve to keep the physicians away. A court that watched its heirs fall in a row like that did not reach first for epidemiology, and the whisper that ran through Versailles in those weeks was poison. The deaths were too many, too fast, too convenient for somebody, and fingers pointed at the Duc d'Orléans, the king's nephew, a known dabbler in chemistry, next in the line of power if the little boys died. And the whisper grew loud enough that autopsy findings were argued over in public, and Orléans himself demanded to be tried and cleared. No tribunal ever found anything. The medical descriptions run true to measles and smallpox doing what measles and smallpox do, and modern historians see epidemic disease plus aggressive bleeding and nothing more exotic. But the rumor opens a window on the mental world these people lived in, where the invisible killers hadn't been named yet, where a family could be erased in a season, and where malice made more sense than microbes, since malice, at least, was something a court understood. Count the toll from the old king's chair, his son, dead April 1711, his granddaughter by marriage, the delight of his old age, dead February 1712, his grandson, dead 6 days later, his 5-year-old great-grandson, dead 3 weeks after that. 2 years more, and his other adult grandson, the Duc de Berry, was gone as well at 27 after a riding accident, an internal rupture, days of vomiting blood while the doctors bled him for it. 5 heirs in dust inside 4 years, and between the throne and chaos stood one small boy behind a locked nursery door. Louis XIV was over 70, and he carried it with a composure people found almost frightening, and then, in the summer of 1715, his own turn arrived, and the manner of it was as terrible as anything the family had yet endured. It announced itself on the 10th of August, 1715, as a pain in the left leg on the ride back from a hunt at Marly. Fagon, the chief physician, a brilliant, stubborn old man who had guided the royal body for decades, diagnosed sciatica, prescribed the usual, and continued diagnosing sciatica as the leg worsened through the following days, as walking failed, as the king took to being carried, as dark blotches surfaced on the skin of the limb. Senile gangrene, we'd now say, the circulation of a 76-year-old, possibly diabetic body giving out at its furthest extremity, the tissue of the leg beginning, plainly, to die while attached to a living man. The surgeon Maréchal saw the marks and knew, and pressed for amputation while amputation might still matter, an operation on a man that age, without anesthesia, that few survived. And the king declined it, with what looks in the record like a decision that 72 years on the throne was a finished sentence. What followed filled 3 weeks. The flesh of the leg blackened, from the foot upward, dying in place, and dying flesh liquefies as it goes, seeping steadily, giving off one of the worst odors the human body can generate, and that odor now inhabited the ceremonial center of Versailles, the king's bedchamber, the room the whole palace was built around, where etiquette required the court to continue attending. And the court attended. They stood in that room, in that air, in their silks and their powder and their pressed handkerchiefs of perfume, and watched their king rot upward from the foot, day by day, because presence was duty and duty did not smell. In the black flesh, incisions were made down to the bone in search of sound tissue, and found none. A peasant quack from Provence was allowed to dose the dying king with a secret elixir mixed in wine, since the greatest physicians of the age had nothing left, and for a day or two the elixir was credited with a rally, and then it wasn't. Louis handled his death the way he had handled the Fistula, as a public performance requiring flawless execution. He summoned his court and apologized for the bad examples he had set. He gave orders about his own funeral. He had the 5-year-old heir brought to the bedside, the boy from behind Ventadour's door, and told him, in front of witnesses who wrote it down within hours, that he had loved war too much and building too much, and that the child should not copy him in either. Advice from a rotting man to a 5-year-old that the 5-year-old, to be fair, largely followed. Finding Madame de Maintenon and the servants weeping, he asked them why. Had they believed him immortal, since he himself, he said, had never thought so? Toward the end he drifted, prayed, lapsed into coma, and at 8:15 on the morning of the 1st of September 1715, 4 days short of 77, he stopped after 72 years on the throne, the longest verified reign of any monarch in European history, ended by his own left leg. Even his corpse kept court appointments. The autopsy was conducted, per custom, on a table before an audience of officials. The body opened and divided as royal bodies were. Entrails destined for Notre Dame, heart for the Jesuit church in Paris, the rest embalmed for Saint-Denis, and the doctors noted the oversized stomach and the worms and the gangrene traced to the bone. And when the funeral procession moved out for Saint-Denis by night, the road told the new truth of things. Crowds gathered along the route, and they did not kneel. Accounts from the time, Voltaire among the later reporters of them, describe people drinking, singing, and openly jeering the coffin of the Sun King as it passed, tents and taverns doing cheerful business along the funeral road, a population wrung dry by his wars and famines, seeing him out with mockery. Inside the palace he had built, the courtiers were already reorganizing themselves around a 5-year-old, and Versailles itself went briefly quiet, since the regent moved the little king and the government to Paris, and for 7 years the greatest building in Europe stood nearly empty, its cesspits resting, its corridors clean for the first time in living memory, waiting. The waiting ended in 1722, when the young Louis XV, now 12, was brought back and the whole machine restarted, the courtiers flooding into their old attics, the cesspits resuming their work, the towns swelling around the palace to serve it. By mid-century, the town of Versailles held tens of thousands of people whose entire economy was the court, laundresses and wig makers and sword renters and sellers of second-hand royal dinners, and everything already described simply continued at greater scale, with a few refinements and 1 or 2 new horrors. The town, while we're passing through it, kept the books the palace preferred not to. Its parish registers absorbed the deaths the palace exported. The servants and soldiers and small courtiers carried out to die by the rules we've covered, and its churchyards filled on a schedule that alarmed the priests who managed them. Urban burial grounds of the period being shallow, reused, and dug in ground already saturated with a century of prior occupants, so that the neighborhoods around them complained of the smell of their own dead ancestors in warm weather. A complaint 18th century France eventually took seriously enough to start moving cemeteries out of towns altogether. Versailles ran a hospital too, founded under the old king for the poor and the sick of the court service population, perpetually underfunded and perpetually full. Several patients to a bed in the fashion of the age, fevers and fluxes and childbed cases side by side under one roof with no notion of contagion between beds. And the honest summary of 18th century hospital care is that it gathered the sick into one building and let charity do what it could. The gap between the palace's plumbing budget and the hospital's entire budget would make you whistle, and the people of the town lived their whole lives inside that gap, washing the court's linen and burying the court's dead and buying the court's leftover pheasant on the days they could afford it. Among the continuities, the diseases of intimacy. Syphilis had been resident at the French court since the 1500s, and the culture of Versailles, with its official mistresses and its unofficial everything else, kept it circulating at all levels, from the grandest bloodlines down through the servants' stairs. Court society politely called it the Great Pox, to distinguish it from the small one, and managed it with the medicine of the day, mercury, taken as ointment, as pills, as vapor baths, sufferers sealed into cabinets with heated mercury fumes, and the treatment announced itself as loudly as the disease, since mercury poisoning loosened the teeth, ulcerated the mouth, and produced pints of uncontrollable drooling per day, the salivation being taken as proof the cure was working. A courtier who vanished from society for some weeks and returned gaunt, with a ravaged mouth and a new wig, had told everyone everything without a word spoken. The patches went on, the paint went on, and the dance resumed. Under all the silk at any great ball of the period moved an unspoken census of chancres and scars and mercury gums, and everybody knew and nobody said, and the fashion for high necklines and patches and paint did a great deal of quiet work. About those physicians, the ones we keep meeting at bedsides making things worse. A court doctor of the period diagnosed chiefly by pulse and by urine, and the urine examination was thorough, held to the light, swirled, smelled, and, by the diligent, tasted sweetness on the tongue being a genuine and correct indicator of what we now call diabetes, so give them that one. Treatment, though, always circled back to the same trinity of bleeding, purging, and the syringe, applied with a confidence total enough to bleed a dying 5-year-old, and applied hardest to the patients who could afford the most care, with results we've already toured. Being rich at Versailles bought you more medicine, and more medicine was frequently the last thing a body needed, and the parish registers of the town make no distinction between those killed by their diseases and those killed by their cures. Underneath the whole enterprise, meanwhile, ran an army almost nobody wrote about: the laundry. If cleanliness was linen, then the actual scrubbing of Versailles happened at one remove, in the wash-houses and along the watercourses where thousands of shirts, chemises, sheets, tablecloths, napkins, and the monthly linen of every woman at court went to be boiled, beaten, bleached, and returned. Laundresses handled with their bare hands the intimate cloth of the entire palace, the sweated shirts, the soiled sheets of the sick, the rags of every description, in cold water, in all seasons, for wages that kept them poor forever, and the whiteness at every noble throat was manufactured by red, cracked, chilblained hands a mile away. Women's monthly needs, on that note, were met with folded linen cloths, pinned or belted, washed and reused, managed by maids, and simply never mentioned in any polite document of the age, one of the very few bodily functions Versailles managed to keep genuinely private, mostly by refusing to have a vocabulary for it. Birth, on the other hand, had no privacy at all, and the delivery room at Versailles was one of the most dangerous public venues in France, for reasons of pure protocol. A queen's child was the property of the state before it drew breath, and the state intended to witness the drawing. The custom of the public royal birth existed to make any switching of infants impossible. the succession verified by eyewitnesses at the moment of arrival, and the witness list at Versailles ran to whoever could fit through the door. When the Queen of Louis XIV delivered in 1661, the chamber was packed with princesses and duchesses jostling for sightlines. And on the 19th of December, 1778, the custom arrived at its catastrophe in the bedchamber of Marie Antoinette. She had been queen for 4 years and pregnant at last after years of humiliating public speculation about the marriage. Labor began in the small hours, 12 hours of it, in a December chamber, with every window sealed against the cold and pasted over, the room heated, crowded, and airless even before the doors opened. Etiquette held that the court must be summoned the moment birth was imminent, and when the accoucheur called out that the queen was about to deliver, the palace emptied into that one room. Madame Campan, the queen's waiting woman, was there, and her memoirs describe the torrent of people pouring in so thick that it nearly killed the queen. The great and the merely curious shoulder to shoulder, some 200 by the fuller accounts, most dammed up in the outer rooms, but dozens breaking through to the bedchamber itself, and 2 of them, by Campan's account, climbing onto the furniture for a better view of the queen's opened body, spectators perched on tables in a sealed, stove-hot room packed past breathing. The child came, a girl, and was carried off to be examined, and the room's attention went with the baby, and on the bed the queen began to die. The heat, the crowd, the 12 hours, the airlessness, and by some accounts a hemorrhage, together shut her down, her face darkening, and Campan says it plainly, the queen was suffocating. The accoucheur shouted for air and hot water. The sealed windows would not open, so they were forced, the accounts crediting Louis XVI himself with wrenching the casements open with a strength, Campan writes, that only his tenderness could have given him, December air flooding across the bed, the surgeon opening a vein in the queen's foot, the blood coming, and the queen coming back with it, while guards physically hauled sightseers out of the room by their collars. She had delivered an heir's sister in front of a paying attention public, and nearly been killed by the audience. Louis XVI, a man history mostly convicts of indecision, decided something that day and never revisited it. No more public births, and when the Queen delivered the Dauphin 3 years later, the room held family and necessary officials only, and one of the oldest customs of the French crown was quietly dead, at the cost of one near asphyxiation. Bearing the children was half the gamble, and keeping them was the other half, at every level of that society, including the top. Royal infants went straight to wet nurses, carefully vetted country women, since queens did not nurse, and then ran the same gauntlet as everyone else's children, in a century when 1/3 of French children died before 5. Rank purchased no exemption, and the palace's final decade proved it with a cruelty that shaped history. Marie Antoinette bore 4 children. Sophie, the youngest, died at 11 months in 1787, of convulsions following what may have been tuberculosis. An infant death the Queen mourned far past what etiquette allotted for a baby girl. And the first Dauphin, Louis-Joseph, the boy whose birth had finally secured everything, began around age 7 to bend. tuberculosis of the spine, the disease eating the vertebrae themselves, one shoulder rising, the back curving, the child fitted with an iron corset in the hope of holding his skeleton straight while he ran fevers and wasted. An 8-year-old reduced, in his own recorded words to his mother, to tears that he could no longer run and play like other boys, propped on pillows at ceremonies to receive bows, visibly dying in guilt rooms for 2 years. He died on the 4th of June 1789, aged 7.5, at Meudon, 30 days before the Bastille fell, and his parents were granted almost no time to grieve him, since the Estates General was in session and France had begun to come apart, and deputies pressed the shattered king for an audience within days, drawing from Louis one of the saddest sentences of the century: "Are there no fathers among them?" Before we get to 1789, though, the palace has one more great death to stage, the worst one, to the reign of Louis XV in its long, strange twilight, and to the daily texture of life in a building that was now over 100 years old and aging the way overcrowded buildings age. The archives of the building's administration in these decades, the paper's Newton Mind, are a catalogue of decay in the House of Splendor. Chimneys smoked so badly that apartments became unusable in winter, their occupants filing complaints that sat in queues for years. Torch and candle smoke had blackened ceilings that Lebrun had painted for eternity. Bedbugs colonized the paneling of lodgings that dukes schemed to obtain, and the standard remedy, fumigation and repainting, worked until the neighbors' bugs walked back in. Rainwater found its way through the famous roofline and down the famous walls. And the sanitary complaints in the files are wonderfully, horribly specific. Residents protesting that the privy pipes running through the thickness of the walls had cracked and were seeping, and that the seepage was coming through the ceiling into the room below, onto the furniture, one aristocratic household's waste descending by gravity into another aristocratic household's drawing room, with the building's office replying, in effect, that funds were short and the queue was long. People of enormous rank lived for years downstream, in the plainest sense of other people's toilets, inside Versailles, and kept living there, since an apartment in the palace, leaking or not, remained the most valuable address in the kingdom. Through these corridors moved Louis XV, and he was, for our purposes, 2 men at once. Here was the most polished product the palace ever made, a strikingly handsome king with exquisite manners, and also the century's great connoisseur of morbidity, a man whose private conversation kept circling to death, who would interrupt a pleasant supper to ask a courtier where they intended to be buried, who slowed his carriage to study fresh graves in country churchyards, who once, encountering a funeral, sent to ask the age of the deceased and brooded on the answer all evening. The court found the habit unnerving and gave it a name: his taste for tombs. He had been the 2-year-old behind Ventadour's locked door, the boy whose entire family died around him in 1 year, and whatever that did to a person, the court got to live with it for 6 decades, and the ending he eventually met feels, with hindsight, like the one thing he had been rehearsing for all his life. He had never had smallpox. 64 years old in the spring of 1774, and one of the few adults of his generation never marked by it, a gap in his defences the whole court knew about. Inoculation existed by then, the deliberate planting of a mild case to forestall a deadly one, and it was being practiced in England and debated in France, and his physicians had considered it for him and held back, the risk to a 60-something royal body judged too high. So the gap stayed open. In late April 1774, staying at the Petit Trianon, he felt the first shivers and headache after a day's hunting, and on the 27th he was ill enough for the machinery to engage, and the machinery's first move killed any chance he had of a quiet illness, since etiquette required that a king of France be sick at Versailles, in the state bed, where the rituals could be performed. So they moved him, feverish, jolting in a carriage from his little garden retreat to the great palace, into the ceremonial bedchamber at the heart of the building, the same room where his great-grandfather had rotted, and the doctors, 14 of them by the end in relays, began by bleeding him 3 times in the first days, pints of blood out of a 64-year-old at the onset of a massive viral infection. Then, on the 29th, by candlelight, an attendant holding a taper close to the king's flushed face, the physicians saw the rash coming up, and around 10:30 that morning the diagnosis was spoken aloud, smallpox, and the word went through the palace like a struck bell. They kept it from him at first. The physicians and the family around the bed agreed to say nothing to the patient, partly from the era's habit of protecting the sick from their own diagnoses, partly from raw politics, since the moment the king believed himself dying, the mistress would have to go and the confessors would come, and Du Barry's whole faction had everything staked on delay. So for days the most famous sick man in Europe was the last person at Versailles to know what he had, until he held his own hands up to the light, saw the pustules risen on them, and, by the accounts that came out of the bedchamber, understood at once, saying that this was smallpox, and that he had never had it, and that at his age one did not recover from it. 60 years of dinner-table conversation about death, and when his own finally introduced itself, he recognized it faster than his doctors would admit to it. From then on, the palace ran 2 parallel theatres, the sick room performing hope, and the courtyard below performing mathematics, crowds gathering daily to pass the health bulletins posted at the gates, phrasing weighed like scripture, while inside, the betting had already moved to the succession. Everything about the sick room now became a matter of court politics. His unmarried daughters, mesdames, middle-aged princesses who had spent their lives in his shadow, installed themselves at the bedside to nurse him around the clock, though not one of them had ever had the disease, a devotion that amounted to volunteering for a coin flip with disfigurement or death, and they stayed for the duration, breathing that room's air day and night to the end. His mistress, Madame du Barry, tended him too in the early days, until the progress of the disease made the next requirement plain, since a dying king must confess and receive the sacraments, and no confessor would approach while the mistress remained. So on the 4th of May, Louis sent her away, weeping, from the palace she had ruled, a dismissal that told him, more clearly than any doctor's face, what the doctors were not saying. And the disease he had was the confluent form, the worst version, in an aging body emptied of several pints of blood, and it went to work on him as described earlier, except that this time the sickbed stood at the center of national attention, and 6 memoirists were taking notes. The pustules rose and multiplied and merged. The king's face swelled and crusted over until the features were buried, contemporaries reaching for the same image independently, a mask of bronze, the skin brown-black, cracked, weeping, the handsomest man of his age erased from his own skull while he lived. The scabs blackened. His throat erupted inside, the pustules lining it so thickly that swallowing became a labor and speech a rasp. And then came what every witness struggled to describe: the smell. Confluent smallpox in its late stage putrefies the skin while the patient lives, the body decomposing on the outside ahead of schedule, and the stench pouring off the king filled the bedchamber, defeated the open windows, pushed out into the antechambers and the gallery beyond, courtiers performing their attendance in relays and retreating gagging, some fainting outright. And the Aile de Boeuf, the famous waiting room of Versailles, stood nearly empty for the first time in anyone's memory since not even ambition could hold most people inside that air. His daughters stayed. The old man swam in and out of lucidity in the heat of his own decay, confessed, made his public act of contrition before the assembled court, apologizing through a ruined throat for the scandal of his life, and lingered, the death throes beginning on the morning of the 10th of May, 1774, and lasting hours. A lit candle stood in a window of the death chamber, visible from the courtyard, placed there for one purpose. At 3:15 in the afternoon, somebody snuffed it, and the palace answered with a sound Madame Campan set down in her memoirs and clearly never forgot. A rumble from far off, growing into something absolutely, she says, like thunder. The entire court, hundreds of people running as one body, out of the dead king's apartments and through the galleries toward the rooms of the 20-year-old who was now Louis XVI, the parquet booming under their feet, the age of one king ending in a stampede of silk shoes racing to be first in line with the new one. The new king and his queen, hearing the roar coming at them, are said to have dropped to their knees. What remained in the state bed nobody wanted to touch, and I mean touch. The disease had so consumed the body, and the terror of contagion so gripped the household, that the ordinary rites of a royal death collapsed. The lying in state, the opening of the body, the separate destinations for heart and entrails, traditions of centuries, all waved at a stroke, and Louis XV became the only king of his line denied embalming, since no surgeon would put a knife into that corpse, one physician reportedly observing that any man who attempted it would not survive the work. Decomposition, already underway before death, now ran unopposed and fast, and the accounts are blunt about the speed and the smell. The problem got very practical very quickly. Somebody had to put the body in a coffin, and the palace servants refused. And in the end, so the accounts of the funeral tell it, they brought in the wine harvesters of the town, the vendangeurs, laboring men judged sturdy enough for the job, who manhandled the King of France into his casket, while everyone of rank stood well back. The body went wrapped in aromatic cloths into a double casket sealed with solder, packed with quicklime and doused, by several accounts, in spirits of wine, every trick available for containing what it held, and witnesses swore the smell defeated the solder anyway. 2 days after his death, at 8 in the evening, the coffin left Versailles at a fast trot. A fast trot. Royal funerals were state pageants that took months to organize and a full day to process, and this was a convoy of roughly 20 pages and 50 grooms on horseback with torches, most of them pointedly not in mourning dress, moving at speed through the dark. And the Baron de Besenval, who watched it, wrote that it resembled less the last honors paid to a monarch than the removal of a burden one was in a hurry to be rid of. The route to Saint-Denis ran through the edge of Paris, and the people of Paris turned out in the dark along it, and they jeered. Sheltered by night, Besenval says, they gave free rein to their mockery, and other accounts add the detail that stings most, that the crowds shouted hunting cries at the coffin. Tally-ho, tally-ho, the calls of the chase flung after the great huntsman as he was galloped to his grave. Of the whole vast court he had fed and housed and enriched for 60 years, one man, the Maréchal de Soubise, rode with the body. It reached Saint-Denis at 11 at night and went into the vault with minimal ceremony, and the epitaphs began circulating in Paris within days, the most repeated of them running, roughly, "Here lies the 15th of the name, and God preserve us from a third like him." He had been christened by his people, in his youth, the well-beloved. The nickname the pamphlets used now inverted it exactly, and nobody ever called him beloved anything ever again. The bill for the sick room, meanwhile, came due across the palace. Campan counted it in her memoirs, more than 50 people who caught smallpox merely from loitering in the galleries of Versailles during those 2 weeks, 10 of whom died of it, courtiers and servants who had done nothing but breathe the building, and versions of the story would later inflate that into everyone who entered the chamber dying, and the truer figure needs no inflation, one man's deathbed seeding 10 more through the corridors of his own house. His daughters, the ones who never left the bedside, all took ill, and, in one of the few mercies in this whole account, all survived, scarred but alive, having spent their inheritance of luck in a fortnight. The new reign opened with a piece of medical courage that doubles as a timestamp for how attitudes were turning. Within weeks of watching what smallpox did to his grandfather, 20-year-old Louis XVI and his 2 brothers had themselves inoculated. In June 1774, the live disease deliberately introduced into the royal arm on the advice of the Progressive Party of Medicine, against the loud objections of the Conservative one, and all Versailles held its breath through the prince's controlled fevers, and all 3 came through, and the court, being the court, immediately converted the event into fashion, the Queen's hairdresser producing a commemorative style, the pouf à l'inoculation, a rising sun and serpent arrangement worn in celebration of a medical procedure, on hair, and hair is where this story goes next. The heads of the 1770s were entire ecosystems. The pouf, the towering constructed coiffure of Marie Antoinette's court, ran to 1/2 meter, and more of the wearer's own hair teased over wire frames and wool pads, whitened with flour-based powder, set with pomade, ornamented with feathers, ships, gardens, allegories. Building one took a professional hours, so a finished head was an investment, worn for days, protected at night in wraps, refreshed rather than rebuilt. And pomade is rendered animal fat, and a warm, scented grease sculpture worn on a human head for a week in unwashed rooms drew the guests you'd expect. The long scratching rods went up into the architecture after itches. Court satirists claimed mice nested in the great heads overnight. And while satire exaggerates for a living, the special caged nightcaps sold to keep vermin out of dressed hair were real merchandise, and a lady's maid disassembling a 2-week poof worked through territory no satirist needed to invent. Flour on the head, meanwhile, in a country running short of bread, made its own political statement, and pamphleteers did the math out loud. The powder on the court's hair weighed against the loaves it might have been, and the heads of Versailles grew somewhat less towering as the 1780s darkened. The woman under the most watched head in Europe was living, all the while, inside a hygiene of pure paradox. Personally fastidious past the standards of her age and publicly exposed past anything we'd tolerate for a minute. Her waiting woman campagne preserved the scene that says it all. The Queen's morning shift of clothes was a ceremony, and the right to hand her each garment belonged to the highest-ranked lady present. So one winter morning the Queen stood stripped for her clean chemise, as the honour changed hands down a chain of arriving grandeur, the chemise passing from waiting woman to duchess, gloves ceremoniously removed for it, then a scratch at the door, a princess of the blood, higher still, the chemise handed back, transferred afresh. The Queen of France standing naked the whole while, arms crossed over her chest, visibly freezing, muttering, by Campagne's account, "This is odious, what importunity," while 4 adults completed the protocol for passing her a shirt. Cleanliness had finally arrived at Versailles. Daily baths, daily linen, a queen who actually washed, and etiquette had promptly wrapped even the washing in an audience. Every function of her body from her wedding night onward had officials assigned to it, her linen inspected, her cycles the subject of ambassadorial dispatches to Vienna, her mother across Europe better informed about her daughter's body some months than the daughter's own husband, and when she carved out Trianon precisely to have one place with no audience in it, the pamphlets punished her for the privacy with invented orgies, and the woman who bathed every day was drowned in printed filth no water could touch. Outsiders wandering the palace in those last years caught the whole disjunction at a glance. The agricultural writer Arthur Young, touring France on the eve of the Revolution, walked into Versailles like anybody else, that open-door policy still fully in force, and recorded his plain astonishment at the traffic, sightseers of every condition rambling the state-rooms, and men in rags, actual beggars, strolling unremarked through the king's apartments while the royal family lived its scheduled day around them. A penetrability without parallel, he wrote, at any other court in Europe. The famous smell by then was woven into the fabric in the most direct way, a century of traffic ground into floors and hangings, the cesspits of the 1680s still in service under the parquet, and all the improvements of the age were racing a building that had 100-year head start. Improvements were, in fairness, genuinely coming, and the last 2 reigns deserve their engineering credit. Under Louis XV, the palace acquired proper small bathrooms in the private apartments, tubs with taps, water heaters, rooms scaled for a person instead of a ceremony, and the bidet established itself in royal furniture. Under Louis XVI came the real revolution, the lieu à l'anglaise, English-style water closets with valves and a flush of water, a court page named Ezek, describing the king's own with something like wonder, and the building's office rolled the technology outward through the 1770s and 80s, dozens and then hundreds of flushing closets installed across the royal residences, drains dug, the old open sewers of the town covered over, a sanitation program pushed by a king with a genuine mechanical streak who liked nothing better than a well-made mechanism. Give the poor man this much: the Louis who inherited the filthiest palace in Europe was the one who actually plumbed it, and history barely mentions it, since he started a century late and finished, as it turned out, about 15 years short. The deadline arrived on the 5th and 6th of October, 1789. A crowd of Parisian market women, several thousand strong, furious over the price and absence of bread, marched the 12 miles to Versailles in the rain, and by dawn on the 6th had broken into the palace itself, through those famously open doors, up the Queen's staircase, killing 2 of her bodyguards at her door, their heads carried on pikes, the Queen running barefoot down the private corridor to the king's rooms with the crowd behind her. By that afternoon, the royal family was in a carriage to Paris, escorted by the mob, the guards' heads bobbing ahead of the procession, and the family never spent another night at Versailles. The palace stood suddenly, totally still. After 107 years of continuous overcrowding, the building emptied in a day, the courtiers scattering, the servants dismissed in waves, the fountains stopped, and the corridors that had never once been silent went silent. The town died with the court, and the speed of it shows just how completely this whole world had hung from one thread. Versailles held 50 or 60,000 people in the summer of 1789, every trade in it feeding on the palace, and once the royal family rolled away toward Paris, the money simply stopped. The wig makers had no heads, the laundresses no linen, the surdo stalls no leftovers, and household by household the town packed up and drained away, until within a few years the population had fallen by nearly half, grass coming up between the paving stones of avenues built to carry the traffic of a kingdom, whole streets of fine houses standing empty with their shutters banging, a boom town in reverse. The people who stayed were the poor who had nowhere to go, wintering in a place built by and for money that no longer existed, and travellers passing through in the 1790s describe a strange, oversized, half-abandoned town, crouched at the feet of an enormous silent palace, both of them waiting to find out what they were for now. What happened to the place afterward resembles an estate sale at the end of the world. The revolutionary government, needing money, inventoried the contents of Versailles and auctioned them, 17,000 lots across a year of sales beginning in 1793. The beds, the mirrors, the tapestries, and, yes, the close stools, the velvet-covered pierced chairs of the court of France, catalogued, numbered and knocked down to dealers and bargain hunters, the most intimate furniture of the dead monarchy dispersed across Europe at revolutionary prices. Somewhere out there, in private collections and museum stores, those chairs survive, and every so often one surfaces at auction with its provenance attached, and bidders pay handsomely for it. And I'll leave each of you to sit with your own feelings about that. The bodies, though, got the harsher liquidation, and this is where the story of Versailles Hygiene reaches its actual last chapter, in October 1793, at Saint-Denis, when the revolutionary government ordered the royal tombs opened and the dynasty destroyed. Its remains tipped into common pits, and workmen spent days hauling the Bourbons out of their vaults, and the accounts of what they found close our story, with a precision no novelist would dare. Louis XIV, dead 78 years, came out of his triple coffin blackened but whole, recognizable, the embalmers of 1715 vindicated across a century, and the workers stood him up for a look before pitching him into the trench with quicklime. And then they opened Louis XV, the king nobody would embalm, sealed 19 years earlier with his quicklime and his aromatic cloths, and the sources describe the corpse as swimming, dissolved, in abundant water, the coffin brimming with the liquid of him, and the smell that came off it dropped workmen where they stood, the crews scattering, burning powder and firing muskets to scour the air. Men reportedly sickening afterward, the disease and the haste of 1774, preserved under solder for 2 decades and released in one breath. They got him into the pit, and the lime went over him, and that was the last the world ever smelled of the court of Versailles. The palace itself survived, since demolishing it cost more than ignoring it. It stood stripped and echoing through the empire, dodged a scheme or two, and was reborn in the 1830s as a museum. And today, 10 million people a year walk the Hall of Mirrors, on average about 27,000 a day. A crowd, funnily enough, of almost exactly the old size, moving through rooms that now smell of floor wax and other tourists. The tubs and taps are labelled. The 200 close stools are wherever the auctions scattered them. And down under the gardens, under the groomed gravel, the old reservoirs and conduits of the Sun King's water war still thread the ground, some of them still in use, water moving quietly through 17th century stonework toward fountains that now run on a posted schedule for everyone, whether or not a king is watching. And that's where I'll leave it, with the water still running. Thank you so much for spending this one with me. I know it was a long sit and a grim one, and if you made it all the way here, you're my favorite type of person. If you enjoyed it, the like button really does help more than it should, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one. Enormous thanks to the Patreon crew and the YouTube members keeping the lights on. Links for all of that are in the description and the pinned comment. Tell me in the comments which detail is going to follow you around this week. Sleep well and mind the corners.